The grain lay scattered across the stone-golden hard, utterly useless. Ayana held a handful up to the pale morning light, watching it catch the sun like amber jewels. Beautiful, but her children were starving. It was the second season of drought, the one that would be whispered about for generations in their tribe. The animals had vanished. The fruit trees bore nothing but dust. The roots they usually dug from the earth had shriveled into bitter, stringy things. And the grain, the wild grain that covered the hills around their camp, had seemed like salvation when the first kernels ripened weeks ago. Her people had gathered it frantically, collecting basket after basket, certain they had found a solution to their hunger. But it was a cruel joke. No matter how hard you bit into the raw kernels, your teeth couldn't crack them. They sat in your stomach like little stones, passing right through your body, offering nothing but false hope. Ayana had watched her mother try everything, pounding them on rocks until they became powder, mixing them with water, eating them soaked in morning dew. Nothing worked. The kernels mocked her with their promise of plenty. Her youngest child, Kavi, whimpered somewhere behind her. He did that a lot now. Not crying that took energy they didn't have, just a small repetitive sound like a bird with a broken wing. Ayana closed her eyes, gripping the grain tighter until it dug into her palm. How had it come to this? Their tribe had survived famines before. They knew the land, knew which routes were safe, which berries to seek. They had the hunters, the trackers, the wisdom of the elders. But nothing had prepared them for this. She was grinding the grain again, almost without thinking, when she smelled something strange. Part 2. The mistake that changed everything. The fire had been burning all morning. Ayana had it going in the shallow pit near her family's shelter, heating water for what passed for a meal these days, mostly boiled leaves and the occasional bone she could beg from the hunters. Her hands moved mechanically, crushing the useless grain into finer and finer powder with a smooth stone against a larger flat rock. She had become so numb to her own efforts that at first she didn't register the smell. It was sweet, warm, completely unfamiliar. Ayana looked up, confused. In her lap, on the flat grinding stone, the grain powder had begun to smoke slightly where she had accidentally pushed a pile of it too close to the edge. The fire had caught it. And that smell it was coming from the burned kernels. Her first instinct was to brush it away. Burned food was wasted food. She couldn't afford waste. But something stopped her. That aroma was doing something strange to her body. Her mouth was producing moisture, the first time in weeks she had felt that response to the prospect of food. Her stomach was actually waking up, remembering what hunger felt like, which meant something had triggered a primal recognition of food. She stared at the singed powder. A few grains at the edge of her stone were turned golden brown, charred at the very tips. Without quite understanding why, Ayana pinched some of the burned powder and brought it to her nose. The scent was incredible, complex. It smelled like warmth and richness and something her brain could barely remember, a sense memory of fullness, of satiation, of life. She touched her tongue to it. The taste made her gasp. It was bitter from the burning, yes, but beneath that was something entirely new, something nutty and deep and strangely satisfying. Her mouth wanted more. Her body wanted more. For the first time in months, eating seemed like it might actually accomplish something. Ayana looked at her pile of useless grain, then at the fire. What if she could control that burn? What if there was a way to apply heat to the grain in a way that would make it different? Not wasted, but transformed. She scraped the burned powder into the hollow of her hand, then sprinkled it into a container made from a hollowed gourd. The powder hardly looked like much, barely enough to matter, but she mixed it with a tiny bit of water and approached her youngest child. "Kavi," she whispered, "try this." The little boy's sunken eyes watched her carefully, suspicious of anything that deviated from their usual diet of boiled leaves. but the smell reached him, and something in his face changed. His mouth opened. Ayana fed him the mixture on the tip of her finger. She watched his face carefully, searching for any sign of poison, of danger. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then his eyes widened, and then, for the first time in weeks, Kavi smiled. Part 3. The First Experiment. Over the next several days, Ayana became obsessed. Obsession, she would later realize, was a luxury of the desperate. When there was nothing to lose, you could risk everything. She began experimenting with different methods. The first approach was chaotic and produced mostly smoke and ash. She would place the grain directly in the fire, watch it pop and explode, chase the pieces across the ground as her people laughed at her madness. But each attempt taught her something. The kernels that fell at the edge of the flames, not directly in them, didn't burn to black dust. They turned golden. They stayed intact. So she moved to a stone. She would place a flat rock directly over the fire, supported by smaller stones on either side, creating a platform. The heat rose through the rock, and when she poured the grain onto it, something magical happened. The kernels would begin to move, to dance across the hot stone. If she stirred them constantly with a stick, they would turn golden all over, and the smell grew richer, more complex, more intoxicating, but it was still just grain. It still was hard. When her children tried to eat the heated kernels, their teeth still couldn't break them effectively. Ayana knew she was missing something. There was something in her memory, something barely out of reach. She had seen something, learned something that was relevant. She sat by the fire one evening grinding the hot grain between two stones, and suddenly she remembered. Her mother, years ago, teaching her about preparing seeds for planting. The way seeds would sometimes soak overnight in water, becoming softer, their hard shell beginning to split. Water and time, her mother had said. These make hard things soft. Water and time, and now heat. She poured some of the roasted grain into a container, then covered it with water. The grain settled to the bottom, and she left them there through the night, more out of necessity. She was too tired to do anything else than from any clear plan. In the morning, something remarkable had happened. The grains had absorbed the water and swollen. They were softer now, the texture transformed. When she bit into one, it actually broke. It actually crumbled between her teeth. And it was edible. It was digestible. It was food. "It is magic," her eldest daughter Sarah whispered, watching her mother work. "You have become a witch." Ayana didn't feel like a witch. She felt like someone who had been handed a puzzle piece by accident and was slowly figuring out where it fit. But she could see how it might look to others. Just weeks before, they were starving. Now there was a source of genuine nourishment, and she had made it happen not through hunting or gathering or any of the traditional skills that governed survival. She had made it happen through, what? Observation, experimentation, a willingness to fail repeatedly. Part 4. The Next Discovery. But the roasted grain, soaked in water while edible, was still unsatisfying. It was like eating tiny rocks that were merely softer. Your stomach could process them now, but they didn't stick to your ribs. They didn't create the sense of fullness that your body craved. They didn't satisfy. One afternoon, Ayana was experimenting with more of the grain, trying different levels of roasting, when she accidentally left a pile of the soaked grain sitting near the fire for too long. She had been distracted. Kavi had scraped his foot, and it was showing signs of infection, and she was worried. When she returned, the grain had begun to ferment. The smell was wrong, sour, like old animal skin. She was about to throw it all away when she paused. She had noticed over the past few days that food left near the fire, in the warm, humid air of the tribe's cooking area, sometimes underwent strange changes. Meat would break down, leaves would turn to slime. It seemed like decay, like the food going bad. But there was something else in it too. Sometimes these foods became easier to digest. Sometimes they actually became more nutritious. Ayana knelt beside the fermented grain. The smell was definitely sour, but beneath the sourness was something else. That nuttiness again, that richness. She tasted it. To her surprise, the fermented grain was actually better than the soaked grain. It had developed a tang that made her mouth water. There was a complexity to the flavour that hadn't existed before, and when she swallowed, she felt full faster. The fermented grain seemed to go further, to satisfy more completely. What was happening? How was decomposition making the food better? She didn't have words for fermentation or probiotic organisms or enzymatic breakdown, but she had something equally powerful, curiosity, combined with the evidence of her own senses. This worked. The fermented grain was more nutritious, more satisfying, more delicious than any form of the raw grain she'd tried. And then came the moment that would change everything. Ayana was working with more fermented grain, trying to dry it out to preserve it for the coming season, when her hand slipped. A handful of the fermented grain powder fell directly onto the stone she was heating over the fire. It was a small pile, perhaps enough for one meal. She should have brushed it away. Instead, she found herself watching it as it sat on the hot stone. The powder began to change colour. It turned golden, then amber, then slowly brown, and it began to puff. She leaned back in case flames appeared, but none did. Instead, she watched in amazement as the powder seemed to rise up on the stone, expanding before her eyes. The edges turned slightly darker, then almost black. The smell became overwhelming, rich and nutty and warm and like nothing she had ever experienced. When she was certain it wasn't going to catch fire, Ayana used a stick to push the mass off the hot stone and onto the ground to cool. After a few moments, she picked it up. It was hard on the outside, but when she broke it, the inside was strange. It was still warm. It was full of tiny holes, like some small creature had burrowed through it. And when she touched it to her mouth and nibbled, she felt something extraordinary. It was almost sweet, with a deep, complex flavour that seemed to grow more interesting the longer she chewed. Part 5. The Birth of Bread. For the first time in years, Ayana laughed. This was it. This was the thing she'd been searching for without knowing she was searching for it. The roasted grain could be boiled and eaten. The fermented grain could be eaten as is. But this thing that had come from the combination of roasting, fermenting, and heat, this was something entirely new. This was food that was greater than the sum of its parts. Over the following weeks, Ayana refined her process. She learned that not all fermentation was created equal. Some methods produced bitter, unpleasant results. Others created that rich, satisfying base that worked well. She learned that if she mixed the fermented grain powder with a specific amount of water, it would create a thick paste, and if she let that paste sit for a while, the fermentation continued, creating bubbles. When she heated this bubbly paste, the bubbles would expand and create those wonderful holes. She built a simple oven, really just a pit dug deeper into the earth, with stones arranged around a fire. She learned which woods burned hottest and longest. She learned to judge the heat of the stone by spitting on it and watching the moisture dance. She learned that timing was everything. Too brief, and the inside would be raw and soggy. Too long, and the outside would burn, or the inside would dry out completely. She failed constantly. She created rocks that couldn't be eaten. She created paste that fell apart. She created things that were burned on the outside and liquid on the inside. But she kept going, and with each failure she learned something, and gradually it took weeks, then months. She began to create something that worked, something delicious, something that didn't just sustain you, but actually made you want to eat more. Something that, when you tore a piece off and put it in your mouth, felt like a celebration of survival itself. She called it the gift of heat and patience. Her people simply called it bread. Part 6. The Revolution. Word spread slowly at first. In a tribe of perhaps 50 people, one person's discovery can take time to resonate. But food? Food was the universal language. When people began to see that Ayana's discovery could actually solve the starvation problem, everything changed. The tribe's leadership came to her. The hunters, who had not caught anything in weeks and were beginning to feel the edge of desperation themselves. The elders, who held the knowledge of the tribe's survival. They wanted to understand. They wanted to learn. Ayana taught them. She gathered the women and some of the men who were interested and showed them the entire process. The roasting, the fermenting, the mixing, the heating. She showed them how to recognize when grain was ready to ferment. She showed them how to judge the heat of the stone. She showed them how to know when the bread was ready to eat. It was like watching a ripple spread across water. As more people learned the process, more experimentation happened. Some of the women began to modify the recipe, adding crushed berries to create different flavors. One man discovered that if you added salt to the dough, it tasted better and lasted longer. Another woman found that mixing the grain powder with fat from animals created a richer texture. The bread became better, more varied, more sophisticated, and as the quality improved, more of the tribe's calories came from this new food source. The grain, which had seemed like a curse, became a blessing. The starvation that had threatened to destroy them became impossible. Within a year, the tribe's survival was secure. Within 2 years, they had shifted their entire settlement closer to the grain-growing areas to ensure a steady supply. Within a generation, bread had become the foundation of their civilization. Part 7. The Consequence. But here is where the story becomes complicated. Here is where the first breadmaker's discovery begins to reshape human existence in ways she could never have anticipated. Because with reliable food came the ability to stay in one place. With the ability to stay in one place came the capacity to build permanent structures. With permanent structures came the possibility of culture, of art, of writing, of government, the very foundations of civilization itself. But also with bread came something darker. As the grain became central to survival, control of grain became central to power. The hunters, who had once been the most valued members of the tribe, began to lose status. The bread makers, the grain growers, the managers of the harvest, these became the elite. And with that shift in power came hierarchy, came inequality. For the first time, some people in the tribe had significantly more than others. Families that controlled larger grain stores became wealthier. Families that didn't could be told they couldn't have bread unless they gave up something of value, their labor, their possessions, their independence. Ayana watched this happen with growing horror. She had never intended to create inequality. She had only wanted to solve the hunger. But bread, it turned out, was more than food. It was power. It was control. It was the foundation upon which all future hierarchies would be built. When neighboring tribes discovered what Ayana had created, they didn't just want to learn how to make bread. They wanted to control the grain. They wanted to control the people who made the bread. Wars broke out over grain stores. Tribes that had previously lived in relative peace became adversaries competing for access to bread-making resources. In her final years, Ayana would sometimes sit alone and wonder what she had done. She had solved one problem, starvation only to create a dozen others. She had given humanity food security, and in doing so had given them the tools to build civilization. But civilization came with all its complications: government, war, hierarchy, exploitation. Part 8. The Legacy of the First Bread. Yet here is the remarkable thing. Ayana's discovery couldn't be undone. The knowledge of bread couldn't be unlearned. Once humanity knew it was possible to transform inedible grain into sustenance through fire, water, and time, that knowledge was permanent. Tribes that adopted bread thrived. Tribes that didn't fell behind and eventually were absorbed or disappeared. Bread became the staff of life across the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs had it placed in their tombs for the afterlife. Roman soldiers were given rations of it to maintain their strength. The Christian tradition made it sacred, transforming it into a symbol of divine body and spiritual sustenance. Islam honored it as a gift from God, and recipes were passed down through generations as precious family secrets. Different cultures adapted the basic concept that Ayana discovered. In China, they fermented grain into a different form. In Mexico, they created tortillas. In Ethiopia, injera emerged. In India, roti was born. Each culture took the core principle that grain could be transformed into nourishment through the application of heat, water, and fermentation, and made it their own. And all of these traditions trace back to the first time someone, let's call her Ayana, though that's just a name for a woman whose real name is lost to history, decided to experiment with fire and grain, and the willingness to fail repeatedly in the pursuit of survival. Ayana's life would have been hard. She probably didn't live to be old. She likely died believing that her greatest achievement was merely creating a way to feed her children through one more season. She probably never imagined that her discovery would eventually lead to the rise and fall of empires, to the development of writing itself, which would emerge as a way to keep records of grain stores, to the entire trajectory of human civilization. But that's what happens when one person decides to look at a problem differently, when they're willing to fail repeatedly in pursuit of a solution, when they observe carefully, adjust constantly, and refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Part 9. The Science Behind the Miracle. Modern food science has revealed what Ayana discovered through pure experimentation. Bread is a biological miracle. When grain is roasted, the heat breaks down the outer hull, making the nutrients inside more accessible to your body. When fermentation occurs, beneficial microorganisms, yeasts and bacteria, break down the grain's starches and proteins into simpler compounds that your digestive system can process more efficiently. These fermenting organisms also produce gas, which creates those wonderful holes throughout the bread structure, and they produce flavor compounds, literally hundreds of them, that give bread its incredible taste and aroma. The heat that Ayana applied in her stone oven did multiple things simultaneously. It killed the fermenting organisms, preserving the bread. It continued to break down the grain structure, and it created the Maillard reaction, the chemical process that creates new flavor compounds when proteins and sugars interact under heat. Without understanding any of this chemistry, Ayana had discovered one of humanity's most sophisticated food technologies. She had managed to transform a grain that was almost completely indigestible in its raw form into something that was not just edible, but delicious and highly nutritious. She had created a complete protein when combining it with legumes, a complete nutrition when added to a varied diet. In other words, she had invented a technology that made civilization possible. Part 10. The First Bread Maker's True Story. We don't know who Ayana really was. We don't have records of her, or any of the early innovators who discovered fire or cooking or cultivation. But we know that bread emerged around 12,000 years ago, at the very beginning of human civilization. We know that it emerged independently in multiple cultures: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, which suggests that this discovery was almost inevitable once humans began cultivating grain. What made bread special wasn't that it was the hardest to discover, it was that it was the most transformative. It took one of the greatest challenges facing early humans, how to get enough calories to survive, and solved it in a way that was scalable, sustainable, and powerful. The first bread maker was probably a woman. We know this because in nearly all pre-agricultural and early agricultural societies, women were the ones who processed food. They were the ones who ground grain, prepared meals, managed the cooking. So when the breakthrough happened, it likely happened in the hands of someone like Ayana, someone who was intimately familiar with grain, who had the opportunity to experiment, who had the motivation of her family's hunger, and who had the flexibility of thought to try something completely new. Her discovery wasn't a single moment of genius. It was thousands of small moments of observation. It was failure after failure, followed by tiny successes. It was the willingness to pay attention to a mistake, the grain accidentally burned, the batch that fermented too long, the dough that fell on a hot stone. And it was the courage to say, wait, what if this isn't a failure? What if this is actually so better? That's the real lesson of the first bread maker. Not that bread is important, though it certainly is, but that innovation itself is born from attentive observation of failure, from the willingness to experiment, and from the refusal to accept that this is just the way things are. Epilogue: the weight of creation. If Ayana could have seen the future her discovery would create, would she have made the same choice? Would she have let the grain burn? Would she have mixed it with water and fermented it? Would she have applied heat and created that first loaf? Or would she have, knowing the wars it would cause, knowing the hierarchies it would create, knowing the suffering it would enable, chosen instead to let her children starve? This is the real burden of the first creator, the first innovator, the first person to do something no one has ever done before. You cannot possibly know the consequences of your actions. You can only know that you are hungry, and here is something that might help. Ayana chose to help. She chose to experiment. She chose to fail repeatedly in pursuit of a solution. And in doing so, she set humanity on the path that would lead to everything that came after, all the beauty of civilization, and all its darkness too. That is the true story of the first bread maker. Not a hero, not a genius, but a hungry person willing to pay attention to her own experiments and trust what they showed her. In the end, that's all any of us ever are. We are people trying to solve the problems in front of us, doing the best we can with what we have, and hoping that our solutions create more good than harm. The first bread maker did that, and the world was never the same.